Right, so let's take a look at the different energy systems in a little more detail so you can understand how they work, how long they can be active, and how they recover, because that's the key to enhancing performance. So the immediate energy system, or the ATP PC system, is probably my favorite because it's the simplest. It's the easiest to understand because it does not involve complex chemical reactions and so on. Basically, as I said, if you suddenly start to exercise, so if I give you this weight like this gentleman's lifting here, and I tell you to lift it, you're going to primarily utilize the immediate energy system, the ATP PC system, to replenish the ATP that's utilized during this activity. So it is the system that is relied on most heavily during very, very high intensity explosive exercise. When you begin to lift this weight, like this guy does, what will happen is you will rapidly use up the ATP that's already present in your muscle cells. The ATP will be broken down to ADP and phosphate. As ADP levels in the cells go up, that stimulates the immediate energy system to start to become active. This system, the immediate energy system, is going to then utilize phosphocreatine or creatine phosphate, which is stored in the cell, already there in the muscle cell, and it is a one-step chemical reaction. We're going to break down the creatine phosphate. That will release energy. That energy will be directly used to turn ADP back to ATP. So when you're lifting this weight, you will start to have a buildup of ADP. Your ATP levels will drop because you're using it up, and this system kicks in and rapidly starts to regenerate ATP. It does it very quickly, and it can regenerate ATP at a very quick rate. This system, the immediate energy system, is an anaerobic system, meaning it does not require oxygen, so you can hold your breath while you lift this weight if you want. It's also what's called alactic, meaning it does not produce lactic acid and therefore doesn't necessarily have a buildup of waste products like the second system we're going to learn about does. It just relies on intercellular levels of creatine phosphate, which is stored in the muscle fiber. The amount of creatine phosphate that's stored in muscle fiber can change depending upon your training. So this is a system that we can train and make more effective. This energy system, the ATP PC system, immediate energy system, is the primary energy system that you utilize in very short, highly explosive, highly powerful, fast type movements like lifting a weight, throwing a baseball or a softball, and so on. So during high intensity, maximally explosive exercise, this energy system can fuel our ATP to power that type of activity for approximately 5 to 10 seconds. So if you were to be sitting in your chair and suddenly decide to sprint all out, this system can cover you for the first 5 to 10 seconds. And it is able to be activated very quickly because, as I said, it's a very short and simple chemical reaction. The PC that's broken down, the phosphocreatine that's broken down, when you do this maximal activity, still resides in the muscle cell and requires ATP to put it back together. So if you do sprint for 5 to 10 seconds, if you continue to sprint, you cannot use this system anymore because you will have broken down all of the phosphocreatine in your skeletal muscle. And the only way to basically put that molecule back together is by utilizing ATP. And your muscle cells will prioritize and save that ATP for muscle contraction and not utilize it to make more phosphocreatine until you either stop exercise or your exercise level decreases enough so that you have extra ATP on hand. One thing that's interesting, as I said, this system is trainable. So if you take a novice individual working out, do a muscle biopsy, look at the amount of phosphocreatine in their skeletal muscle, and then have them do a 6-week training program, you'll actually see that in response to that training, especially if that training involves a lot of high energy explosive activities, their amount of phosphocreatine will go up, therefore making this system able to stay active for a little bit longer period of time. There's also a good bit of evidence that creatine supplementation can also add to the PC stores found in skeletal muscle, therefore extending the effectiveness of this system. Again, meaning this system could maybe, instead of being on the 5-second, kind of end, more towards the 10-second end in response to training and with potential supplementation, or having enough creatine in our diet, which can come from red meats, etc. The second energy system that's available to skeletal muscle is anaerobic glycolysis, also known as the lactic acid energy system. Both of these names kind of give us an idea of how this system works. Anaerobic means without oxygen. Glycolysis means the breakdown of glycogen. We can also use glucose in this system. And lactic acid energy system refers to the byproduct of this system, which is lactic acid or lactate. This system is still able to produce ATP at a fairly rapid rate, not as quick as the previous system, but also takes several more steps in the process and does not produce ATP as quickly because of that. It has a longer range or longer endurance ability before we start to be unable to use this system, and we'll talk about that. So this system is best for, again, relatively short duration, high intensity exercise. Basically things that take longer than several seconds. Because it does take several seconds of even maximal activity before this system really can sort of get ramped up and start to contribute. So as I said with the previous system, if I was to start sprinting as fast as I can, the first 5 or 10 seconds will primarily come from the immediate energy system. But after several seconds, this system will start to become active as well and also start yielding a significant amount of ATP. However, it cannot produce ATP as quickly as the immediate energy system, and that's why we cannot sustain that top speed for more than 10 or 15 seconds, because we can't just keep up with the need for ATP. So the energy to resynthesize ATP in anaerobic glycolysis comes from the breakdown of glucose, either glucose itself or its storage form, which is called glycogen. So glycogen is basically the storage form of glucose in skeletal muscle, in the bloodstream, but also in the liver. So we do readily have some glycogen stored in the muscle cell to fuel this initial activity. As those levels start to drop, however, the skeletal muscle can start pulling glycogen from the bloodstream and glucose from the bloodstream to help continue this system and fuel this system for longer periods of time. In this system, what happens is glycogen and glucose is broken down. It is a fairly complex chemical set of reactions, but we start with glucose and glycogen. It's broken down with the end result being energy that's released to synthesize ATP from ADP, and then a waste product or byproduct that's called pyruvate or lactate. It can be either of those two molecules. Lactate is can also be called, you can use that term interchangeably with lactic acid. So the waste product or the byproduct of this series of reactions, this energy system, is a buildup of pyruvate and or lactate in the skeletal muscle itself, which will then leak into the bloodstream. This system is a little different in that there is an actual investment phase. It utilizes some ATP at the beginning of these molecular reactions and then produces more ATP at the end. So there's an energy investment phase where some ATP is actually consumed to power this system, but then at the end we produce more than we used at the beginning. So the net result of this system is that basically for every glucose molecule we get 2 ATPs produced. So if we break down one glucose molecule, we get 2 ATPs. If we break down glycogen, if we start with glycogen, we get 3 ATPs. So it can produce ATP from these again, macronutrients that are present in the skeletal muscle itself, but then also that can be delivered by the bloodstream. The reaction occurs in the skeletal muscle system itself, just in the sarcoplasm of the muscle fiber. On average, in a trained individual, this system can work maximally. So if you're going all out in a sprint, this system can go for about 2 to 4 minutes until we start to build up enough lactic acid and lactate and this system starts to fail and not be able to keep up with ATP production. So in a trained individual, this system can work for 2 to 4 minutes. Obviously, it relies upon the presence of enough carbohydrate or glucose to be utilized to produce this ATP. As the cellular levels of glucose, the muscle cell levels of glucose drop, we can take more glucose from the bloodstream. That's why we have these capillaries around skeletal muscle that can supply these types of things, and use that glucose to produce more ATP. If oxygen is also present, this anaerobic glycolysis is actually the first step in the aerobic process of ATP production as well. So if oxygen is present, we can actually utilize the pyruvate to make more ATP. We're going to learn about that system next. But if there isn't enough oxygen available, then the pyruvate becomes lactate, and the lactate will start to build up in the skeletal muscle and then eventually start to build up in the bloodstream. So if our exercise intensity is super high, higher than we can deliver oxygen, then we start to have this buildup of this waste product, lactate. If you've ever heard the term lactate threshold is one measure that can be utilized to determine endurance capacity. Basically, once you've exceeded your body's ability to deliver oxygen to skeletal muscle, that will result in a buildup of lactate. So, and that is an indicator of what workload you can work at to before you start to not be able to deliver oxygen quickly enough. So if you take a world-class marathoner, put them on a treadmill and slowly, have them run 10 minutes at this speed, then increase the speed, eventually you'll get to a speed where lactate starts to build up in their bloodstream. That's their lactate threshold. That's the point where they cannot deliver oxygen quickly enough to prevent the buildup of this waste product lactate. So it's an indication of how well the aerobic energy system is working. So anyway, in aerobic glycolysis, however, what happens is we're breaking down glucose or glycogen and formulating more ATP. And again, this system can work for about 2 to 4 minutes and fuel, again, fairly high intensity activity for about that period of time. So in terms of anaerobic ATP production, we have two systems that we can utilize. The two systems are the ATP-PC system. The ATP-PC system can work for about 5 to 10 seconds, and it relies on phosphocreatine and ATP. We stick the phosphate group back on, and what ends up happening is we have ATP and creatine that's present in the cell. And that can work for about 5 to 10 seconds and provides a near immediate source of ATP to fuel muscle contraction. Anaerobic glycolysis can give us about 10 to 30 seconds of maximal effort. And if we're running at a slightly below maximal effort, it could give us up to 2 minutes, 4 minutes, and so on. It produces ATP about 100 times quicker than the aerobic glycolysis, which we're going to learn about next. So still is a very great way to develop or deliver a large amount of ATP to working muscle. And again, what happens is we start with glucose and we end up with 2 pyruvates or 2 lactates. We end up with pyruvate if oxygen is available. If oxygen is not available, we end up with lactates. And then it results in the production of ATP. So the energy investment phase requires the input of ATP, but then we produce 4 ATP at the end. So we end up with a net production of 2 ATP for each glucose molecule. This also does result in the formulation of lactate or lactic acid. And this buildup of lactate and lactic acid can be a contributor to fatigue. At least the research seems to indicate that. And it indicates the potential that we're working at a workload that we cannot sustain.